Hey guys, we are back today talking about President Andrew Jackson. Mr. Payne did the first couple of sections talking about the elections of 1824 and 1828 and the age of Jackson. We are going to jump into some of the big things during his administration that make him the famous president that he is. So we are going to start by talking about states' rights, and then we'll talk in our next video about the bank. So Andrew Jackson is going to be faced with a couple of different problems during his administration. The ones that we are talking about are going to follow us into the next couple of sections as we continue to do this online learning. So let's start with states' rights. States' rights comes from the issue of a tariff. So let's flash back to the War of 1812. Remember, we were fighting against the British. And at the end of that war, we go back to being casual friends. But Britain needs to up its market. So one of the ways that it's going to try and make more money is by flooding the US market with all of these really, really cheap goods. So, like we talked about in the past, China does this a lot. They make really, really cheap goods, sell it to America so that Americans buy Chinese goods instead of American goods. Britain is trying to do the same thing. In 1816, at the era of good feelings, one of the things we did to combat this issue was to pass the tariff of 1816 so that we would tax all of these goods, and that way we would convince people to buy American. Now, when we passed this tariff originally, it was seen as extremely nationalistic because we were trying to protect America. We did not want to buy anything from the British. We were still reveling from the War of 1812, so we were anti-British. As we go on through the decade, though, those sentiments kind of go back down to regular levels. We don't hate Britain anymore, and we're going to continue to try and pass this tariff. But by 1824 and 1828, Congress is trying to increase this tariff and make it larger. So, say instead of doing 20% extra tax on British goods, they do a 30% extra tax on British goods. And that's actually going to cause sectionalism. So, remember what sectionalism is. It means that we are looking at our region or our local government as being better than our national government. We want to focus on our local problems, not on the national problems. So let's see why that is. We have a specific region that we keep talking about that is not friendly with the tariff. That would be the South. The South is opposed to the tariff because it makes all of those manufactured goods more expensive. So remember, for our economies, you had the North that was producing the manufactured goods, you had the South based in agriculture. Now, in order for agriculture to work, you need the manufactured products so that you can actually continue to farm your land at a better rate so that you produce more cotton. So all of the farm equipment that you need, that is produced in the North. In order to buy it, you want to get the cheapest price possible. So using that information, let's talk about what's happening in 1828. Vice president at the time is a guy named John C. Calhoun. He is from South Carolina, and he's actually a pretty nationalistic guy. He gets into politics early on at the War of 1812. He's going to rise through the ranks, House Representative, Senator, up to the VP position, eventually tries to get the presidential nomination, but he tries to be nationalistic at heart. So originally, he's a supporter of the tariff. However, as we see time go on, he sees that his home state of South Carolina and the South in general are starting to get hurt by this tariff. Originally, they were buying cheaper manufactured goods from the British, but as the tariff continues to increase, they are unable to afford, they being the South, are unable to afford to buy the tariff, buy their products, and are forced to buy these American made products which are only really benefiting the North. So when I say the South is forced to buy more expensive Northern goods, that's what I'm talking about. Can't buy their original cheaper goods from places like Great Britain. So what the South starts to see is that they are not benefiting from this tariff. It's only the North that's benefiting. In other words, the South is paying for the North's prosperity. There was an economic depression that happened in 1819 and hurt the South more than the North, and the South still hasn't recovered from this yet. So by forcing them to buy all of these more expensive products in the North, the South is going to be extremely upset, and they rally their guy, John C. Calhoun, because he's an original Southerner, to try and speak with the president and with Congress in their favor. What he ends up devising is called the Nullification Theory. Now, we have talked about nullification in the past. When we talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts under John Adams, we had our guys, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, write about nullification. It is the belief that if the government, federal level, so if the national government writes a law that is considered unconstitutional in the eyes of the state, that they can nullify or void the law. So that is the nullification theory. It questions the legality of applying federal laws to states. And here's the reason that John C. Calhoun thinks that people will believe in the nullification theory. When we started out as the United States, we were 13 individual states that had come together and created a compact or an agreement between each other. The thing that is holding those states together is this agreement that they will follow laws that benefit everybody. In this case, Calhoun goes to his next statement saying that states can reject laws it believes is unconstitutional. In other words, it can reject laws that they believe are hurting individual states. And Calhoun is actually going to take it a step further, and this is why this theory is important to us, because we will see the ramifications of it when we talk about the Civil War. In part 3, he says that if states do not agree with the laws and they deem them unconstitutional and they don't want to follow that law anymore, they can nullify it. If nullification is not accepted, then the states have the right to leave the union. So let's go over that one more time. The states came together and formed an agreement with each other. If the state in question wants to nullify a law because it doesn't apply to them, they have the right to do that. If that nullification is rejected and the other states say, no, we're going to pass it anyways, then the state has the right to leave the union. So that is the basic principles of the nullification theory that Calhoun brings up and actually writes on paper, and it gets published. Now, he doesn't attach his name to it because he is a political figure. He doesn't want to create this national divide, but he does need to back up his state, which is South Carolina. So let's see how this goes. When the theory is brought up, there is a major debate that happens in January of 1830. Senator Robert Haney is going to be the Southern person, the person who views that the tariff is bad, that states have a right to deny it. And he is going to be debating with one of the, he's called Godlike Webster, big guys, who's a nationalist who's had his name out there for a while, Senator Daniel Webster. So Webster is going to be the nationalist. He's going to back the view of the Union. We need to do what's best for the country. Versus the Southern view, which is this is actually hurting a specific region of the country and therefore it's not fair. This, guys, I want you to see this is no different than what's happening right now with the coronavirus. You have the view of keeping the nation closed, that we need to protect all, that it is in the best interest of all citizens to have the stay-at-home orders, versus individual states who want to break the stay-at-home order because it is going against their right as a state to have their own individual liberties. So this is no different than arguing against those and breaking those laws, saying that we as a state like Open NC can go outside because it is our right as a state to not have to follow state laws, or excuse me, national laws. So just keep those kind of arguments in mind, and that means you understand the nullification theory. When Congress argues it, there's no real agreement or disagreement reached. Pretty much everybody draws their own sides. So it is actually brought to Andrew Jackson, president at the time, to give his own opinion on it. Jackson, at a private dinner party, goes and gives his opinion by saying the Union must be preserved. We cannot function as the United States if we do not have ourselves together, north, south, and west. In effect to this, Calhoun actually responds to him quite harshly and is like, our liberty is actually more important. You can't have a country working together if some people's liberties are more important than others. So in effect, Calhoun is going to resign as VP from Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's going to replace him with this guy named Martin Van Buren. And Calhoun is going to go off on his merry way and try and actually become a pretty famous guy within the state of South Carolina. That's why you see statues of him everywhere if you ever go to South Carolina. All right. In response to nullification being rejected, South Carolina is going to take a stance against the national government and excuse me, declares that the 1828 and 1832 tariffs do not apply to them. In other words, they nullify those tariffs. They go ahead and threaten Congress and say, if you try to force us to follow these laws, which we have declared unconstitutional, then we will secede or withdraw from the Union. So you can see this is a really big setup. This is the first time this is happening. So the Congress is debating with itself, oh my gosh, what do we do if we lose a state? So in order to this, 1833, Congress is going to pass what's called the Force Bill. In other words, they give the Army permission to go into South Carolina if South Carolina continues to abuse its power as a state and go against federal law. Now, what you should be thinking to yourself right now, what other president decided to put down a rebellion from a small group of people because it didn't want to follow national law? Bing, bing, bing. You should be thinking about Washington and the Whiskey Rebellion. If you remember, Washington sent his army into Pennsylvania against the Whiskey Boys, who were going about and refusing to pay the whiskey tax because they felt it went against their right as citizens. Andrew Jackson is going to use the same precedent to go and use the Army and Navy against South Carolina. Now, granted, Jackson is not actually going to have to use the Army because we're going to have the great compromiser Henry Clay come forward and say, hey guys, we can fix this. We have fixed a million things in the past. We have come up with compromises in the past. Let's do the same thing here. So Henry Clay is going to come forward and actually propose a tariff that is a lesser tariff than the original tariffs that were produced in Congress. So we are going to be lowering the taxes over 10 years. South Carolina calms down. Jackson is furious with Calhoun because he's like, dude, you started this entire thing, and threatens to hang him from the nearest tree for treason and going against the national government. That's part of the reason that Calhoun has to go back to South Carolina and be like, ooh, Andrew Jackson does not like me anymore. But we do fix it and calm down the problem by lowering the tariff. So this really is going to be the start of where we start to see the rip between North and South getting heated. With South Carolina threatening to secede this early, we're going to see that we try a whole bunch of different compromises as we keep going forward, but they're not going to work out as well. Stay tuned for our next video when we talk about the National Bank. Let's scroll down here and see some of our lovely political cartoons. You can see how they've come out and about, nullification, all of that. We will be back in a minute with some news on the National Bank.